So the possibility of a conflict over Taiwan is much greater, first of all, than it is over Japan and South Korea.
This is the one issue in which I believe that a great power war between China and the United States is possible.
Taiwan is significant for a variety of reasons, and its fate is significant for a variety of reasons. One, of course, is that over time, Taiwan has evolved from an authoritarian country itself to a genuine functioning democracy.
Taiwan has now been a vibrant democracy for almost 20 years.
Taiwan has a rough and tumble, sometimes not for the faint of heart, democracy.
Taiwan is a thorn in their side.
To have a democratic, ethnically Chinese country sitting off its shores is not something that makes the Chinese Communist Party feel comfortable.
Taiwan is the first Chinese democracy in the total history of China.
It has this established record of a peaceful transition of power between different parties.
And that, I think, is potentially threatening to China.
And increasingly, as those elections play out in Taiwan, one of the groups in larger numbers that are watching how this plays out are across the way in China. And they ask themselves the question privately, look, these are Chinese people that are conducting democracy and elections. Maybe we should be thinking about that here.
Well, if you think about a chess game or the Chinese Wei Qi game that means encirclement, the way Taiwan could help us is to help bring democracy to China.
There's a petri dish, if you will, of democratic principles. That must scare them a lot.
The Communist Party in Beijing views that democratic Chinese society in Taiwan as an existential threat. Dominating the first island chain is all about surrounding Taiwan and helping Taiwan to decide on its own, in the first analysis, to give up its freedoms, to surrender. But if necessary, China is also building up the capabilities it needs to invade Taiwan.
The military of Taiwan has staged exercises aimed at simulating an air attack by mainland China.
In today's scenarios, we assume most of Taiwan's military air bases were severely damaged by the enemy's guided missile attacks.
China's communist regime has claimed Taiwan as its own since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and vowed to bring the island under its rule, by force if necessary. Recent years seem to have led to reduced tensions, but military strategists and political leaders still commonly refer to the possibility of full-scale war.
The possibility of armed conflict arising over Taiwan is decreasing on almost a monthly basis these days.
As I travel around mainland China frequently, one sees Taiwan businesses everywhere.
When I was in Taiwan studying Chinese 40 years ago, even looking at mainland Chinese materials was a crime. You couldn't read their newspapers or their magazines. We students had to read them in a special closed room because they were considered to be contaminating of Taiwan society.
But in recent years, we've seen a dramatic improvement in relations across the Taiwan Strait. Very real economic links being established between Beijing and Taipei.
Now, 20 flights a day, 1 million tourists, the economies are growing closer and closer together.
As a political scientist, we can look at this situation. It should be a case study for how tensions can be mitigated.
The Taiwanese policy right now is one of détente.
And Taiwan itself is a model in some ways for the rest of Asia, that better to not provoke China and deal with trade and economics and tourism because the Americans won't back you up. We declined to sell Taiwan a number of weapon systems they asked for over the last few years. So Taiwan is kind of a test case. Will the approach of seeking cooperation with China work?
They have aligned themselves with the mainland. They're investing heavily in the mainland with businesses. But the political question of resolving the unification of Taiwan with the mainland remains highly unsettled and is not likely to be settled at any time in the near future. In the meantime, China is developing military capabilities that could quickly overwhelm Taiwan's defenses. And this again brings the U.S. into potential conflict with China down the road.
The most critical scenario that we should continue to worry about is the Taiwan issue, because China considers Taiwan to be the last lost piece of territory during the Century of Humiliation.
The Century of Humiliation.
With 100 years of humiliation.
Western powers dominated and humiliated China for over 100 years.
This is a sacred imperative on the part of the Chinese to retake Taiwan and bring Taiwan back into the embrace of the motherland.
China has never accepted the independence of Taiwan, the sovereign independence of Taiwan. And the United States does not have the same type of security commitment to Taiwan that it has to Japan and South Korea. So the possibility of a conflict over Taiwan is much greater, first of all, than it is over Japan and South Korea. The status quo is not agreed upon. It's a first-order issue for China. It defines its sovereignty in terms of including Taiwan as part of a single China.
The Chinese have made it clear that if Taiwan were to declare its independence now, they would go to war against Taiwan, even though they fully understand that that would have major negative economic consequences for Beijing. They understand that, but they would go to war anyway.
Here, Ashley Tellis clinically explains how any explicit Taiwan move towards independence could inexorably draw China and the United States into direct conflict and possibly all-out war.
If China faces the prospect of a Taiwan that appears to be going independent, China will do its best to suppress Taiwanese military capabilities in order to prevent such an outcome from happening, while it simultaneously works to limit the United States from being able to come to Taiwan's defense. And the Chinese tools that will be used in that scenario will be everything from its land-based ballistic missiles targeting American carriers, its land-based ballistic missiles targeting American forward bases, as well as all its conventional military instruments to attack U.S. power projection forces that would be moving to Taiwan's aid. What is the United States to do in such circumstances? It has one of three choices. One is it can decide that the business of attempting to protect Taiwan has simply become too dangerous operationally. And so it changes its political objectives. That is, it cedes Taiwan to China. The second thing it could do would be to simply aim to defeat Chinese warfighting capabilities through local battles that do not attempt to reach and touch the Chinese homeland. And the third thing it can do is to conclude that it will be impossible to defend Taiwan purely through defensive actions alone. And therefore, there has to be some measure of offensive conventional operations that target the Chinese homeland. There is every likelihood that the United States will not do the first. That is, it will not cede Taiwan to China for political reasons. There is every likelihood that the United States will conclude that it cannot do the second. That is, it cannot protect Taiwan adequately through purely defensive means. And therefore, it is compelled to go to option 3, which is to protect Taiwan and all its other Asian allies by including in its strategic mix at least some conventional attacks on the Chinese homeland. Now, this is the essence of air-sea battle.
In fact, an air-sea battle involving American strikes on the Chinese mainland is just one possible response proposed by the Pentagon to Chinese aggression. And the question, of course, is whether Taiwan is worth going to World War III over. Perhaps the best way to answer this is by examining a highly controversial proposal, a so-called grand bargain, that would attempt to trade Taiwanese sovereignty to China in exchange for peace in the rest of Asia.
We should actually pull back from Taiwan, maybe in stages, but we should break that commitment. We should do it, though, in the context of a grand bargain.
I do not believe it is in U.S. strategic interest to even contemplate 19th century-like deals, like we'll give you Taiwan in exchange for, some other regional set of circumstances. I mean, who does that?
And the grand bargain would actually require concessions from China in return for the United States breaking its commitment to Taiwan.
My initial impulse is to, when I hear a suggestion like a grand bargain with China, is to pull my hair out, because I think it's just not going to work.
China would agree to what I'm calling a fair deal on the territorial and maritime disputes in the East China and South China Seas, and that those disputes would essentially be largely resolved, that there would be resource sharing in both of those seas, and that the Spratly dispute, the Senkaku Daiya dispute would be worked out in ways that all the relevant parties consider to be fair.
Well, the idea of having a grand bargain with China to head off war, to cooperate, to work together toward common goals like climate change and anti-terrorism, this is a very American approach. To put it in a common phrase, let's make a deal.
It's time for Let's Make a Deal.
Why can't we make a deal?
There's one other key thing, which is China has to commit or recognize a long-term U.S. security presence in East Asia.
And this approach has been tried with many difficult problems in the past, where unfortunately the outcome has been war.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
So the goodwill of trying to make a deal sometimes turns in, when historians look back on what happened, it turns into the cause of war.
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
And some of the assessments of the origins of World War I and World War II are very similar to that. There were goodwill people who proposed, can't we work together? And this was misunderstood by the other side in a way that had tragic consequences.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
The idea that the United States would walk away from a commitment that it has maintained for some 40 years is absolutely the sort of thing that would make America's allies, not just in Asia, but around the world, question deeply our willingness to be there. This is the sort of thing that would affect not just America's position in Asia, but America's position in Europe.
The United States is not going to give up on Taiwan unless it's forced to. The United States worries greatly about its credibility in Asia. It worries about its reputation. We want to make sure that both the Japanese and the South Koreans, who depend on us for nuclear deterrence, think that we are a reliable ally. If we were, in effect, to sell the Taiwanese down the river, it would send exactly the wrong message to Seoul and to Tokyo, and they would have very powerful incentives to acquire nuclear weapons, which we do not want to happen. So the United States, for credibility purposes, will go to enormous lengths to hang on to Taiwan for as long as it can, to keep Taiwan allied with us.
You have to look at the implications of what might seem like an appealing pullback. Even if you were prepared to abandon Taiwan, what's the rest of the world, the rest of American ally relationships, where are they going to go? What are they going to deduce? And how many of them are going to build nuclear weapons along the way? Or if we decide as a public policy matter to announce that we are not going to defend Taiwan or feel a commitment to help defend Taiwan anymore, Taiwan's going to be tempted to start building a nuclear weapon, which China has already said in advance would be a cause for war. So by trying to avoid danger, you actually increase the danger. It's similar to what Dean Acheson did in 1950 when he declared that South Korea was not in our security perimeter. And the next thing you know, the North Koreans are invading the South Koreans, and then we change our mind and decide, after all, we better help defend the South Koreans. You don't want to put yourself in that place.
The second reason why I think a grand bargain of this sort is not workable is that China has its own interests in these other disputes.
And the second reason that this grand bargain won't work is that the Chinese are not going to be willing to make the concessions that are necessary to placate the United States and its allies. They're not going to be willing to give up on the Diaoyu Islands. They're not going to be willing to make concessions on the South China Sea.
It has reasons why it is pushing out into the East China Sea and the South China Sea.
The Chinese believe that this territory belongs to them, and they're not interested in compromising.
It wants to have greater strategic depth as a way of building its national defense.
What China should do is remain quiet and just continue to grow economically and eventually build up a really powerful military force and then dictate the terms of the settlement. This is what it should do with Taiwan. It's not militarily capable of taking Taiwan back at this point in time, but it should wait till it becomes extremely powerful and then tell the Taiwanese and the United States in no uncertain terms that Taiwan has to now become part of China, and if it doesn't, China will go in and conquer it. And China will be so powerful at that point in time that it can do it.
There's also a third reason why the United States should care about Taiwan, and it's one that's often overlooked, and that's the moral dimension of American foreign policy.
We supported the movement of Taiwan towards democracy, and what this idea that we let Taiwan go in return for resolving all other disputes is that we are depriving them of their own choice of whether they like that outcome.
Do we want to be seen walking away from a country, a place that has spent an awful lot of time creating democratic institutions?
Our allies, our closest allies, Japan and South Korea, are democracies that we helped develop and supported. Taiwan is also now a liberal and vibrant democracy, and so any compromises with respect to Taiwan will raise that issue.
Yes, we do have a commitment to Taiwan, largely on moral grounds, which gets you in an uncomfortable place, so you're really prepared to risk American lives for a moral commitment in this kind of situation.
I think the U.S. does have this moral, or I would call a political ideological interest with respect to Taiwan and its other allies. But those interests are smaller than our security and economic interests, and particularly than our security interests.
That type of agreement for us would be morally abominable. If we have any justification for exercising power beyond our borders, it is to defend free societies, and Taiwan is a free society.
We have an interest in supporting democracies and promoting them. It's not our highest interest, and in this case, arguably, if we can put the other pieces of this bargain in place, on net, we will be better breaking the commitment. It does put that democracy in jeopardy, and so I just acknowledge that is a real cost, and a very unfortunate cost.
At the end of the day, this is an issue not for Beijing, and it's not for Washington. This is an issue for the people of Taiwan. And 23 million people on the island of Taiwan have made it very clear that they want their own country. They do not consider themselves to be Chinese by and large. They consider themselves to be Taiwanese.
The bigger problem for Beijing is that public opinion in Taiwan is not moving in its favor. Surveys show that more and more people on the island see themselves as Taiwanese rather than Chinese.
And however they identify culturally, they do not want to be part of the People's Republic. In survey after survey, you only have single-digit support for unification with the People's Republic of China.
The final reason I don't like grand bargains is that they only work if the two sides that are engaging in the bargain really trust each other and trust each other to carry out the obligations in good faith. The problem with the U.S. and China right now is we don't trust each other. China has serious doubts about our intentions, and we have serious doubts about their intentions.
The United States at this point is not able to significantly influence China. China is not able to significantly influence others because they're not trustworthy, they're not predictable or transparent.
A lot depends on implementation.
For one thing, the Chinese have not been keeping their agreements.
And Chinese are very good at taking a deal and interpreting it in ways that suit them and in ways that are contrary to what we think the deal means.
This is true not only with the World Trade Organization obligations it undertook, it's also with regard to its expansive territorial claims, which are inconsistent with the treaty that it ratified, the UN Law of the Sea Treaty.
And so even if we tried this, which I suspect we aren't, Beijing would probably see this as a trick that's somehow designed to fool them, and simply for that reason they wouldn't be interested.
There's a good reason why the United States has sought to discourage Taiwan's absorption into the mainland, certainly to discourage it from being absorbed forcibly. But there's a strategic reason why, if Taiwan were absorbed by China as it's currently ruled, it would pose a strategic challenge to the United States and to our allies.
Should China control Taiwan, from a military perspective, there's different opinions on how much benefit that would, or by how much that would increase Chinese military capability.
If Taiwan were to fall into the hands of the PLA, they could dig in. That would be a salient or a point out in the Pacific where they would control a lot of radar, a lot of cruise missiles, a lot of missile batteries, and it would threaten, it would cut right across all the sea lanes. The issue of keeping Taiwan on our side of the ledger is paramount in my mind.
I'm not so sure about that. For one thing, Taiwan is only 100 miles off the Chinese coast. For another thing, the eastern coast of Taiwan is not at all amenable to building naval ports. There's only one really significant naval base in northeastern Taiwan, and a smaller one down at Hualien in the southern part of the island. So from a practical ship-home porting basis, Taiwan does not give the Chinese very much, and it would only extend their aircraft range by 100 miles or so to the east.
Maybe the way to think about this is what China gains from getting Taiwan, whether through peaceful or through military means. The first is, from the Chinese perspective, is that it breaks the first island chain in half.
The first island chain is usually delineated by a line drawn from the Kurils through the Japanese archipelago, through the Ryukyus, Okinawa that is, Taiwan, the Philippines, and then swings west through the Indonesian archipelago.
Taiwan is perhaps the single most developed piece of the first island chain once you leave Japan and Okinawa. So to walk away from Taiwan would, in a sense, be to open the gates for China's Navy to be able to access the Central Pacific with very little in the way of other obstacles.
This would be unprecedented in the history of U.S. military posture in the Asia-Pacific since the end of World War II, because, of course, with the heating up of the Cold War, the United States established both treaty relations and military bases along the first island chain, and that architecture has essentially remained unchanged. So, if Taiwan were ever to fall into China's hands, it would fundamentally reconfigure the geostrategic structure of U.S. military power in Asia.
This is clearly a strategic aircraft carrier based in the Western Pacific Ocean.
Defending Taiwan is defending America. It's important for us that if we want to keep the Pacific Ocean free of aggressors, that we keep the Chinese bottled up. If they were to get control of Taiwan, they would have more or less unimpeded access to the Western Pacific. That's why the Chinese want Taiwan. That's why we need to deny them it.
I don't agree with that at all. I think that is based on, flawed reasoning in many respects, and not least that it does not really take into account the interests of the people on Taiwan, who, by the way, have shown very little interest in engaging in arms races or dangerous crises. In almost every opportunity to come back from the brink, they have chosen to do so.
Taiwan under Chinese control, if it were possible for the Chinese to put military bases there, radars, submarine bases, air bases, would be able to project power further out into the Western Pacific much more easily than it currently does. And people in Japan, for example, worry that if Taiwan reverts to mainland control, China will be in a stronger position to potentially threaten the sea lines of communication that flow from north to south to Japan, and to impose blockades or pressure on Japan or potentially on Korea. So Taiwan has, in the long run, potential strategic significance.
Well, my own view is that Taiwan, in the possession of the PLA, would not significantly increase the threat to, say, Okinawa or to a U.S. strategic interest. But I think I'm in the minority, to be perfectly honest. I think any Japanese naval officer, active duty or retired, that I've talked to is of the opinion that possession of Taiwan would, in fact, seriously impact Japan's defensive capability. And I think they say that because of Taiwan's further position to the east and its increased ability to interact with the sea lines of communications that run east of Taiwan and upon which Japan is so dependent.
If you think about it from the Japanese perspective in history, since the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, Taiwan has essentially been a secured flank from the Japanese perspective. And Japan went to war against China and seized Taiwan partly to secure its southern flank. That flank has essentially been secured for over a century for a variety of unique historical reasons. So if China were ever to seize Taiwan, that fundamentally alters the geostrategic calculus for the Japanese, especially given the fact that the southwestern islands, the Ryukyu island chain that Japan owns, stretches all the way down to about 90 miles to the east coast of Taiwan. So it is virtually impossible to geostrategically disentangle Taiwan's destiny from Japan's sense of security.
Probably the greatest act of congressional diplomacy was the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which basically committed the United States to the maintenance of peace and stability between China and Taiwan.
Back in the 70s, when the U.S. de-recognized Taiwan as the legitimate government of China and recognized Beijing as the main government there. Congress then stepped in and said, wait a minute, this is a longtime regional ally and we're going to codify into law our relations with Taiwan. And that was the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which binds the United States legally to Taiwan through these agreements, basically saying that if China tries to take Taiwan by force, the U.S. would be obligated to prevent that, even if using force were necessary.
Taiwan faces the most significant military challenge in the world today.
Should a Taiwan scenario develop, should Taiwan declare independence, or should the United States Navy try to intercede in a scenario involving Taiwan and the Chinese military, that by deploying several dozen or a couple of dozen conventionally powered submarines, China could control the waters within the first island chain, preventing U.S. battle groups from entering those waters.
They see this as a capability that can allow them to defeat the United States, drive it out of Asia.
You can, for example, envision forward-deployed Chinese conventional submarines deployed at certain locations, given the anticipated axes of advance, for example, of an American carrier strike group. And they would be then able to, without being detected, launch their long-range anti-ship cruise missiles in what's called salvo fires. Essentially, a whole group of missiles launch at the same time to overwhelm the fleet defenses of the carrier strike group and hope that one of those missiles gets through and does lethal damage to either the carrier or one of their major surface combatants in the carrier group.
As early as 1993, all the way up until the present day, whoever sits in the presidential office within Taiwan, in essence, is within 7 minutes of destruction.
they're adding something like 100 ballistic missiles to their side of the Taiwan Strait per year.
The key thing that ballistic missiles and land attack cruise missiles bring to the table really is suppressing air defenses. Because once you can suppress air defenses, then you can bring in conventional aircraft, conventional fighter bombers.
They have over 800 missiles that could hit Taiwan just with one salvo. That would be more than enough to suppress Taiwan's air defenses and keep their air force essentially buttoned up and not able to fly. They may not be able to kill all the airplanes, but it would so mess up their runways that they wouldn't be able to fly, which would give the Chinese Air Force the ability to come in then and comfortably drop lots of bombs and take things out.
One of the lessons the Chinese have taken away from the wars of the past 20 years, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the conflict in the Balkans, Afghanistan, is air superiority is essential to winning modern wars. You may not win with it, but you will certainly lose without it.
The Chinese will have ballistic missiles that will be able to destroy the runways of Kadena Air Base, which is the hub of American air power in the Western Pacific. And that would mean that even if the Chinese don't attack all the aircraft, making the runways inoperable would ensure that U.S. aircraft could not take off, and therefore ensure that the United States can maintain air superiority, say, over the Taiwan Strait or over Taiwan itself.
In a Taiwan scenario, China would lay mines to shut off, to close out the main Taiwan ports.
The reality is that Taiwan has only two major ports that really supports the economy.
Keelung in the north and Kaohsiung in the south.
And if the Chinese can conduct the first move and sow mines in the approaches to those ports, Taiwan would essentially be sealed off. There are no other alternative ports that would be able to provide the sufficient throughput to keep Taiwan going.
But would China ever dare to launch such an attack, particularly with American aircraft carrier strike groups waiting in the wings? Here, history may have much to teach us.
March 21st, 1996.
With two U.S. naval battle groups now in the South China Sea, the war of nerves intensifies.
In the spring of 1996, China fired some intermediate-range ballistic missiles off the northern and southern ends of Taiwan in an unsuccessful effort to influence the electorate of Taiwan, which was engaged in the first democratic presidential election on the island.
China's military exercises serve notice to Taiwan that independence is not an option.
In response to those missile firings and other military demonstrations by China, the U.S. dispatched two aircraft carrier battle groups to the area.
We showed up with these two carriers, and to the horror, I think, of many Chinese decision makers, they realized that they had very little options. And in some ways, that humiliating event when the Chinese realized that they couldn't do very much about our show of force is what explains part of this major modernization buildup process that we've been seeing over the past 2 decades. So my question has always been, given the acceleration of China's anti-access buildup over the past decade, if a similar crisis were to occur over Taiwan, would we be willing to do the same kind of show of force? Would we be willing to risk one or two of our carrier strike groups by putting them in the vicinity of Taiwan? And if that crisis occurs and we don't show up, that would have a tremendous impact on the perceptions of our allies and friends about our security commitments to the region. So I think China's anti-access challenge is one that gets to the heart, I think, of our regional strategy and our ability to maneuver in the Asia-Pacific region.
The following exchange illustrates the ambiguity, and some would say hypocrisy, of American foreign policy towards Taiwan. Only time will tell whether this issue will be resolved peacefully or at the point of a gun.
Taiwan is a democratic state with a flourishing democracy and a people of dignity and pride. We want them to work with China. We want those two countries, China and Taiwan. Taiwan is not a country, but it acts and it looks like a country, but we want China and Taiwan to work together to find a future that meets both their interests and to find it with and through peaceful processes. That's in our strategic interest and theirs.
Is that a delicate finesse there when you say it's not a country in terms of the one China policy? Is that kind of...
Well, look, diplomacy has many aspects to it. Some aspects of diplomacy are realizing things as they are. Sometimes it's finding words and frameworks and diplomatic approaches that allow for two seemingly contradictory things to coexist. So as part of the U.S. recognition of China, the U.S. policy is designed to recognize that there is one China. Now, that has served the interest of Taiwan and the mainland for years, because each of them would think to themselves in their own minds, well, we're the one China, right? Ultimately, I think in recent years there is a recognition that the PRC in China is, through the United Nations and other venues, the China that is recognized globally. But Taiwan has established itself as a vibrant economic and political force on the modern stage, and they cannot be simply sacrificed on some altar of unification. There has to be a recognition on the part of friends in Beijing that Taiwan will have a say in how a political dialogue begins.